Fest. I am your co-host, Kent, and with me is your other co-host.
Jason, what up, peeps?
So, Jason, question for you.
What
What
is that?
was the highest grossing science fiction film of 1957 in the United States?
Hmm. I really don't know a whole lot of movies during that time, but I'm gonna probably have to say Rodan.
You are correct. It is a Japanese produced film called Rodan. It came out in Japan in 1956, the year before, and the darn thing was very popular over here, even the United States, a year later, even after they added some of their own edits to the film. And that's what we're discussing today. 65 years of the movie Rodan. And so, again, to continue to repeat for I don't know the umpteenth time now, with these particular panels, these anniversary panels, we are not here discussing the production or the reception of the films during the time in which they were produced and released. There are other sources out there that chronicle this more thoroughly and better than we had the time to. But not only that, we felt that more specifically with this year's Daikaiju Fest, it was more about the celebration, uh, when necessary, of these films. And so that's kind of what we're here to do, is just kind of just have a general discussion about these films, really just talk about them, hopefully celebrate them. Or if you are a particular type of couple films, we are here to um, give you some kind of harsh criticisms, but at the same time, hey, if you love it, you love it. That's all that matters. Um, Take us away on 65 years of Rodan, man.
Well, with Rodan, it's been a surprise to me that that little nugget of facts that that you did at the beginning there, that I did not realize that it was the biggest grossing movie here in the U.S. and
Per August Rigoni. I learned that from him.
okay. But yeah, when it comes to Rodan, I don't even remember if we've even discussed this movie on our podcast or
Oh,
even
we have, yeah.
commented.
Commentating is a different matter, but I know we have
Yeah,
discussed it.
but yeah, I can't honestly remember.
It's been a while.
um, yeah, so it's relatively been many years since I've actually have seen the movie, but I do at least have memories of you know the scenes in this film, and we get familiar faces such as Kenji Sahara, Akihito Hirata, uh, Haruo Nakajima, who plays as Rodan in here. I mean, just some of the familiar faces that you're gonna tentatively see in a lot of the other non-Godzilla kaiju movies, and as well as Godzilla movies. uh, and this is a movie that was made a couple years after the original Godzilla, you know, 1954, and this was made in 1956 there in Japan. And I think this was the first kaiju movie that was in color, uh, if that is correct. Uh,
That sounds correct,
yeah,
yes.
uh, it's just with the whole characters, the plot, the practical visual effects during this time. It seemed to, well, with the characters, I think they did a really good job as far as the performance and what the script had allowed them to do. And comparing this with Godzilla 1954, the original one, they seem to really have improved quite a bit within the 2 year uh, gap that they had there, and it seemed that they from here it seemed, well, uh, Raids Again was a year later, uh, was a year beforehand, and just within that time span, it seemed that Toho started to go on the stride and sort of knew what they were capable of doing as far as the set building, the uh, monster costumes. It the Rodan movie that we get here seemed to be really kind of in that high quality, almost sort of comparing it to the '60s kaiju films. It almost sort of belongs in that, but in that fact, it it was made in the late '50s here, just not long after uh, both the original Godzilla and as well as Godzilla Raids Again or Godzilla's Counterattack. Uh, it's they really have improved their technology and as well as their capabilities, and I think they've done a real phenomenal job with this movie during specifically during that time in that short amount of span from the first Godzilla film and then this.
Yeah, Rodan. Uh, this for many years for me, and it was my favorite Toho non-Godzilla film, and it's still up there. It may not necessarily be my most favorite. I think War of the Gargantuas may have taken that title, but every time I do watch this film, I am very much looking to reconsider what is my favorite Toho non-Godzilla movie, because this film, anybody who has seen it knows exactly what we're talking about here. It's so difficult to really try to put into words because film tends to be more of a visual medium than anything else. And again, like the old adage goes, you have to see it to believe it. This is a spectacularly made film. It by and large is produced by the same crew that did Gojira a couple years earlier. The only difference is that the writer of Rodan is different from Godzilla, and I want to say the last name of the writer is like Kitamura, um,
Yeah, Ken Kuronuma, who did the
Kuronuma. Okay,
who did the original story, and then there's two more tacked on. Was it Takeshi Kimura and then Takeo Murata?
yeah, and I believe one of the writers of Rodan would go on to even write, I think, a couple of the Godzilla films because Shinichi Sekizawa tended to write a majority of the earlier Showa films, and you could always tell the difference. One of the writers of Rodan tended to be more cynical, I guess, for lack of a better term, in his story writing,
Yeah,
whereas Sekizawa was more hopeful
I'm
and
guessing
optimistic.
you're thinking of Takeshi Kimura because
I was
from
thinking that,
his
but I wasn't sure.
bio that he's done ones besides Rodan. He's done Mysterians, Batongo, Frankenstein Conquers the World, War of the Gargantuas, King Kong Escapes, and Destroy All Monsters.
Oh, okay. So, okay. I guess only one Godzilla film. I thought he may have done multiple films. Um, but yeah, Rodan, it's kind of interesting because we first saw this film, I believe it was back in 1993. And
Yeah, I can still remember the video, the VHS cover art for that one.
yeah, I wish I would have kept the VHSs just for the cover art. Um, but the interesting thing is, like, the first third to half of this film is kind of a horror story. It's about the Mega Nulons
Yeah, it's like that
in the
that
mine.
that whole entire sequence of the Mega Neuron and stuff sort of freaked me out during that time period.
It's still creepy, and the funny thing was is that I was 8, 9 years old, kind of in that age range when I first saw this. And typically, I would have probably been like, "Where's the monster? Let's get to the monster." But because this aspect of the film was so well shot and even well dubbed. Okay, because this was
Mm-hmm.
released and distributed by King Brothers back in the day here in the United States. It had me engaged. And initially, when I first saw this film, I'm like, oh, it's got to be like Baby Rodans or something like that coming after these guys. And when I found out it was insects, I actually wasn't disappointed. Like, typically, I would have been like, oh, are you kidding me? This is supposed to be a Rodan film. Like, what's with the insects? But I realized, oh, like it sort of makes sense and stuff. And then we see later when Kenji Sahara gets trapped and he ends up getting temporary amnesia, we find out that indeed, eventually, anyways, a Rodan hatches out of an egg and uses the mega neuron for nourishment. Um, but I really love the first, third or to half of this film because it is very much a well told horror story. And on Ifukube with the Daimajin um, panel, whether that comes before, or after this. If it comes after this, well, you have been given a warning, I guess, or a heads up. But his score for this film is incredible. It is absolute perfection because it captures some of the adrenaline moments. It captures some of the horror and creepy elements. One of my favorite sequences involves this trio of miners trying to go down and look for one of theirs, and they find out that part of the mine shaft has been flooded, and they come across a body of one of their guys who had been missing, but they are like chest deep in water. And no, actually, no, this is after that. They found one guy earlier, and now they're down looking for the second and final guy that had been missing. And they're down there, and they got a rope tied to each other so they don't get
Mm-hmm.
like lost and separated down in the mine shaft. And there's kind of this a little bit of a slow build up, kind of like one of them yells at one point to maybe kind of throw you off for a second, and it's quiet. All you hear is kind of them rustling through the water and a little bit of dripping water in the background. And then all of a sudden, ah, and then the first guy gets dragged down, and then like the other two guys are struggling, and then the second guy goes down, and the third guy's like, ah, and he cuts himself free, and he gets out of the water, and he's kind of stumbling and on his back, and he's using his hands and his feet to kind of crab walk backwards to get away from whatever it is that's coming after him. And we see a little bit of a shadow in a couple parts, and then he's trying to make a call to the people above. The film fades to black, and you hear this blood curdling scream. Ah! It is so perfect. And even Ifukube's score during that time, like it was great that Ifukube kept that build up quiet. And then once that first guy gets grabbed and starts getting pulled under, it's this terrifying orchestral mix that accompanies and complements what is happening in that moment.
Mm-hmm. And whatever you think about Kira Fukube as far as a composer, whether you like him or not, or in the
I'm
middle,
willing to bet 99.999% of
yeah.
people do.
But with some of our criticisms that you probably have known about us for many years, I would say, I mean, with this one sort of in the early times of Ifukube, I think this was sort of one of the areas where he didn't set himself or sort of ground himself to be sort of the person that he later becomes. And I think this was sort of like kind of the more experimental phase of his with Gojira, and then this one here, and I think a lot of his music, I would say, out of all of the music that he's done, with Destroya, uh, Mechagodzilla 2, and then probably this one as well as the uh, first Godzilla movie. I think these are probably one of his better ones out of all the movies that he has composed for, and it's really good. And then as you were talking about some of the characters and how that they were acting, I really like the acting of all the characters, and they just made it so believable with what they had to work with, and with all the acting of a lot of the like the non-Godzilla kaiju movies or gamer films, like a lot of the earlier stuff, they made it really believable, and I would say give kudos to, you know, not only just the writers but the actors and actresses that were in this movie. I really love the acting. They just make it so believable, and as well as trying to give that horror vibe within the earlier parts of this film.
Yeah, I mean, the acting overall is very, very well done. I mean, I would even argue, though, obviously, Kenji Sahara steals the show here because there are moments in which he expresses shock and terror. Most of this range of expressive emotions from him comes in this flashback he has of when he gets separated from the rest of his buddies in the mine, and he ends up getting hit in the head, and he has temporary amnesia, and he comes across, the first Rodan hatching from the egg. And then as he's coming out of this flashback, he's sweating, and he's like got this very terrified express look, and he's just kind of grabbing onto something, before he finally kind of comes out of his amnesia and is able to talk to people and be like, I know what I saw. It's terrifying. It is this. Um, Sahara does an incredible job. He does a significantly better job here than he does in a film like The Mysterians, in which I'm not sure if he's top billed, but if he's not, he's near the top there. But part of it, I think, sometimes is just due to the writing, how a character is written. He does he's serviceable there. But this was early in his career too.
Mm-hmm.
And Mysterians came out when, I think, 58, if I'm not mistaken. And he just does a phenomenal job here with Rodan, just expressing emotions and coming across initially as kind of this tough guy, and then shock and concern when he sees the insects, and then Rodan and just utter terror as he's coming out of his amnesia. It is very well acted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then as far as the story goes, it's a really unique story to the non-Godzilla kaiju film that we don't really get a whole lot with, and with the whole horror aspect, I don't think we really get that a whole lot after this film uh, was made, and I would have wished that they would have done more in that regards, because it just seems like with a lot of the non-Godzilla or Godzilla kaiju films, it seems that they just don't really dabble much into the horror stuff, just more or less the non-grounded sci-fi space adventure type of non-Godzilla or Godzilla kaiju films. Right after this was sort of something that I think a lot of the kaiju films, I think they should have possibly have gone this route a bit more, because it, in my opinion, it really engages the audience into, you know, pay more attention to what's going on, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why that Rodan was the highest grossing film in 1957 here in the United States. Is, for me, I think, and due to kind of that horror uh, type of atmosphere that this film had made.
I understand what you're saying, but then if you try to get movie crews to sort of try to replicate what they did here, all you're going to get from critics and movie viewers is, well, this is exactly like Rodan with some minor differences. But I understand too, you're talking about like trying to capture the atmosphere of it. Gojira is like the closest thing that's come to that. Mothra is different because Mothra is more of a fantastical character. Mothra resides more in the realm of fantasy
Mm-hmm.
more than anything else, whereas Godzilla and Rodan are more of the atomic age. Varan sort of sits in the same area as Godzilla and Rodan. The unfortunate problem with that particular production was the fact that ABC decided to pull funding almost right at the last minute when they were getting ready to shoot the film, those bastards. And as a result, Toho was left with like half of a funded film and then decided to put up just a little bit of extra money, just enough to try to finish the film. And the unfortunate part of that is you get this really mediocre outing in a film in Varan. And so uh, part of the reason why Rodan um, did so well, and this is what I learned from August, is the fact that this was a film in which a lot of people were saying the effects work and the story obviously are superb. I mean, you take a look at the miniature work within this film, I would argue it is some of the best miniature work during this entire Showa period of Toho and maybe in general Japanese science fiction film. It is incredibly well done. To get on the topic of Rodan itself, I love the look of this Rodan. This Rodan definitely is in a similar vein to what a pteranodon would look like. It is more animalistic, whereas most of the designs of Rodan throughout the rest of the Showa era make him look cartoonish and kind of goofy in a
And a
way.
little bit more simplistic, whereas this one, I think,
Yeah,
it made it more kind of horrifying in a way, realistic and terrifying.
yeah. This was not. This was a film in a similar vein to Gojira. This was a film that was meant for adults. Now, I have never really been able to dive too much into kind of the history of Rodan. It's been years since I've listened to the commentary on that classic media DVD. Um, and I there's just not enough in print about kind of the production of Rodan either, although I think that's slowly starting to change. So, I don't know too much as far as like Godzilla. Was there some sort of message trying to come across? Knowing Ishiro Honda, there had to be something. I just probably cannot really think of it off the top of my head. It's just, to me, it comes across as something that is more of just not really a passion project, but just a project that, yeah, is trying to sort of cash in on the popularity of Gojira. Godzilla Raids again did fairly well. Also, um, just kind of milking that cow, so to speak, a little bit. But I'm sure Honda had something to say, and Honda usually tends to be a bit more overt in his messaging. And typically, one of those ongoing messages in most of his science fiction films is humanity in general coming together. You see it a lot in a film like Battle in Outer Space. You see it in some of the Godzilla films where, you get the UN Council coming together and all that. It usually is very overt. Here, it's much more subversive. And I guess I don't know. Maybe the terrors of strip mining. You continue to mine, you're going to find giant insects, and you're going to unleash a prehistoric, hypersonic flying reptile onto the planet. But yeah, that the story and the effects obviously were the main attractions. Uh, to this film for U.S. audiences back in the time. In 1956, the year before, was the year Forbidden Planet came out. And anyone who is familiar with US science fiction films of kind of this period knows Forbidden Planet in some circles is considered arguably the best classic American science fiction film. Others may disagree, but by and large, just about anybody who has watched these films and studied them during that time usually holds Forbidden Planet in a very, very high regard. And
Mm-hmm.
so, to be a film like in 1957, I think you had, The Day the Earth Stood Still may have been out that year. Um, and I think even Earth versus the Flying Saucers
You know,
may have been out that year.
I was just sort of thinking
Um,
about that too.
um, but yeah, like you're talking about classic science fiction films this thing went up against, and from a box office standpoint, it beat them. And part of that was it was color, but again, you watch this film, you know exactly why this thing did as well as it did. Giant monster in color, incredible practical effects, and a horrifying yet engaging story.
Yeah, and I was just sort of taking a look at some of the things as far as this movie goes, and as far as the influence, for obvious influences, we see the Mega Neuron and Godzilla vs. Megaguirus, where it's one of the main things. But as far as the other influence, Stephen King's It book, whereas one of the kids in that was haunted by the image of Rodan, and he sees a giant bird who was Pennywise, and then runs into a steel mill and thinks of Rodan and stuff. That's sort of how some of the influences with some of the other mediums in this, with some of the horror aspects that they pick up on in some of these, like in the later ones, like as far as Stephen King's It book.
And I want to touch upon something that we, I guess, haven't done necessarily a good enough job on throughout the course of this Daikaiju Fest when talking about these anniversary films is sort of its impact over the course of like the kaiju genre. Part of that is just because some of these films have had little to no impact, and so there's really next to nothing to say.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Rodan casts a very big shadow. Um, this, interestingly enough, and again, I'm not sure how well this was received in Japan. I'm sure it did well enough. Um, but I find it interesting that there's never been sort of like a reboot or something like that of Rodan. Um, this is a film where in Western audiences, when people start discussing again non-Godzilla, non-Gamera films that include giant monsters or just other science fiction films in general, Rodan is usually in a lot of people's discussion as far as some of their favorite films. This
Mm-hmm.
is a movie in which a lot of people do recognize the craftsmanship in both the writing and the actual physical building and construction of sets and miniatures and everything else involved in the making of this film.
Yeah, and I think that when it comes to as far as the legacy and impact aspect, I think that this was sort of the foothold or the foundation to what would later become sort of the whole franchise or genre that Toho basically set in motion as far as um, the story, set building, costume design, visual practical effects, that sort of thing. Because when you take a look at uh, the the Rodan movie, I almost said Gamera there for a moment,
How
um,
dare you?
and then compare it to a lot of the later uh, Godzilla, Gamera, and then some of the other non-kaiju films of the 60s and 70s there, it seems like a lot of these movies afterwards sort of had that uh, uh, inf- influence from, or that sort of the similar template
They were
that,
influenced
yeah,
by.
by the by this movie in particular.
Yeah, this is. I would argue, for me personally, out of the solo monster films that I've seen come out of Japan, um, this, in my opinion, is second best. In fact, to be perfectly honest with you, I do like Gojira and I understand the importance of Gojira. I will argue honestly that I think Rodan, in some aspects, if not many aspects, is a superior film to Gojira. I know that sounds, blasphemous, but I will say this: Gojira probably does have the better human story and sort of a deeper meaning and message for its existence, whereas Rodan is probably lacking in those two areas. But I would argue, in terms of execution, um, Rodan, I would say, is probably a better executed film than Gojira. I watch Rodan more than I do Gojira. Um, and that's not a knock on Gojira. And I've talked about some of my minor issues with Gojira on this podcast before, and not to say I dislike it or anything. That's not what I'm saying. Um, but I do think Rodan is a film that is more engaging and is a prettier film to look at, not because it's in color, but because of, indeed, there's just more to it
Hmm.
than in Gojira. And not to mention, too, I think it's sort of unfair in a small way because, Honda and crew, Gojira was kind of the first of its kind, and they did a very good job, but they were still basically learning. And yeah,
Hmm.
they were still learning on this film, but because they had done it before with Gojira, they kind of knew what to expect. However, this film presented different challenges. You were dealing with a terrestrial creature in Godzilla in that first one. Here, you're dealing with a flying creature. You're dealing with one that is spending most of its time in the skies. The only ones you're dealing with that are terrestrial, they're mega nulons, and they're in the film, the first third, kind of in that realm. Um, so, in a way, yes, they took what they learned from Gojira and they made it better with Rodan because they learned. But then at the same time, too, like I said, this film produced some unique challenges that they probably had not faced before with Gojira. And I do believe this film in execution is just a better film than Gojira as well. I think it is the best. Um, it is one of the top two best solo monster films to have ever come out in Japan, in my opinion. I like the original Mothra, but I tend to get occasionally a little bored with it when I watch it. Varan, as we talked about a bit ago, had the unfortunate mishap of ABC pulling out, half of its funding, and as a result, you get what you get with that film. Just trying to quickly think of maybe even the first Gamera film, even though while that was impressive, coming from a smaller studio in Dai, it doesn't hold a candle to this. And this
Hmm.
was a film that was produced 9 years before that first Gamera film.
Hmm.
And this film, Rodan, still comes off looking vastly superior to that one in every aspect. And that first Gamera film, like I said, it coming from a smaller studio and dying and all that, and their first giant monster film, that's still fairly an impressive film as well.
Hmm. And hence why I think that this particular film, I think, set the groundwork in motion and template for what would become the entire kaiju genre. I mean, granted, being a couple movies after uh, the original Godzilla movie, and I think with this one that they really knew with what they were doing, and even with it being 65 years as of this recording. Uh, just with the practical and visual effects, I think that in itself, the effects in this movie, I think, have really aged fairly well. And out of all the movies after that, and even before, I think that this is probably one of the best aged looking visual and practical effects that I've seen in a Godzilla or non-Godzilla film.
I would argue that, and again, a lot of it, as we just said, Gojira was the first one, and so in many ways they were just learning on the job. Um, and I will cut them some slack for that, but I would argue Rodan and Mothra, from a technical standpoint, are very impressive films. Uh, I know I just said a second ago, I'm in terms of watching the movie Mothra, I occasionally get a tad bored with it. But when it comes to the effect sequences, that film is very impressive in and of itself. For example, you had one if not the largest suits ever made in the Mothra larva for that one. And this is one where you've either already heard or will hear when we do uh, you know, our Mothra anniversary special on our 60 years of Mothra special for Daikaiju Fest here. But that is a very impressive film too from a special effects standpoint as well. Both Rodan and Mothra, I think, really exceed head and shoulders above Gojira. And again, I understand that was the first and they were just kind of learning. Gojira, yeah, is still very impressive. Do not get me wrong. But again, I think they continue to learn with each outing, and each film brought with itself some unique challenges to it that they didn't face in the previous project or projects. And I still just think, again, both films, and even Rodan a bit more so, is just so much more impressive than anything else, because when you take a look at a lot of the miniature work and the fact too, like even the one sequence in which Rodan's coming out of a deep river, that was the actual guy in a suit that they pulled out, had to yank out, and those suits were heavy and could easily get waterlogged. Holy shit, the guy probably could have drowned
Mm-hmm.
in that. Like, just how impressive the execution and the destruction of the miniatures and the expansiveness of some of these sets that they did, um, what they did. And Rodan, and I know I've said this an awful lot, is just impressive. It's a film that, the as I've gotten older and also the more I've watched it, I've become to appreciate more of it for its artistic representation as well. And that's not something I do a ton. I tend to watch movies more for entertainment than anything else. And that's not to say I can't appreciate movies as art. I sometimes do, but that's more for films like the Christopher Nolan Batman series, for example. While entertaining, there is more of an artistic vision to that particular trilogy as well that I greatly appreciate. When I think of kaiju films, I think of fun more than anything else. But there are occasional films when you go through the saga, such as Rodan, where when I watch it anymore, I look at it and I go, this is a beautiful film. Like the cinematography, the effects work, all of the stuff that they did to put this product together is incredible.
Mm-hmm. Um, with that, I can't really think much of anything unless if you got anything else to bring up before.
It's
Uh,
impressive. It's incredible. It's Rodan.
well, with that, what is your kind of final thoughts and as well as a rating?
um, to give a quick sort of, I guess, thought on both the American and the Japanese versions of this film, and if you own the classic media DVD, you get both. I would even argue the US edit of Rodan is pretty good. The opening sequence has almost nothing to do with the story at large. Um, and that's very typical of American edits to a lot of foreign films at this time. And it's the standard run of the mill atomic testing type of stock footage that you would see in a lot of these films at that time. They did it at the beginning of Godzilla Raids again, for example. Um, it's nothing new, but I would argue that the dubbing of the American edit is very good. It's one of the better dubs of some of those earlier monster films. But the Japanese film, of course, is still better. The Japanese version of the film is a bit more haunting. Um, I don't think there was as much. Well, I know for sure. There wasn't as much cut out of this film as there was of Gojira. But even then, what was cut out didn't make a ton of difference, but it made enough of a difference to where the Japanese version again is superior. But it's not like head and shoulders like Gojira is to King of the Monsters. There, it's a smaller gap in between, what's better and what's not. Um, they're both very impressive, both the American and the Japanese cut. The Japanese overall, yes, much more. Um, so with that, the Japanese one gets a 10 out of 10. The American edit, though, I still am going to give a 10 out of 10. Like I said, there's not a vastly huge difference between the two of them that I think it warrants, a separate rating. And even again, I think King Brothers did a magnificent job with the dubbing and kind of any small changes that they made on their end. It's still a very good film. It's still one of my favorite kaiju movies in general. It is an impressive film. 65 years later, it still wows me. And like I said, as I've gotten older and more sophisticated and I've been able to appreciate certain things more than I could when I was a kid, I still am just floored at what they were able to accomplish with this film and just how sometimes some people talk about, and we talked about this with the Gamera 2 panel here for this Daikaiju Fest, where just from in that Heisei Gamera trilogy from just 95 to 96, the impressive strides they made just in special effects and how that affected how well Gamera 2 came out just in the short span of like, a year and a half to 2 years from Gojira to this film is impressive as well. 10 out of 10 for Rodan.
Mhm. Yeah, and just with the last time of viewing this, which was, I would say, many years ago, but I can still remember a lot of the sequences in this movie many years later without even watching the movie, and it still sort of has that impact on me, even almost, I would say, 28 years later since our first viewing of this movie on VHS, which I'm obviously assuming is the American version
Yes.
of the cut. And then, of course, I've got the DVD version, which came with War of the Gargantuas, which I think to me is sort of kind of the combination of some of the two best non-Godzilla kaiju movies, and I think that's sort of a smart move by what Classic Media
Hmm.
did on that end. And just with it being made just 2 years after the original Godzilla movie, and then with all the learning and improvements from since then, they it real for me. I think that this film really set the groundwork and the template for many movies that come after Rodan here. And yeah, it's to me, I think it's one of the better uh, non kaiju movies out there. And
Well, it is a kaiju movie. You mean non-Godzilla?
oh yeah, non Godzilla kaiju movies. um, and I think that this is something really worth for a lot of the people that want to get into the whole kaiju experience or genre, and maybe a little bit of the classic 50s horror or sci-fi films. I think that this would be one of the top ones I would at least suggest for those to view, just with the good storytelling cast, uh, visual and practical effects in there. Rodan, I think it's one of the best, if not the best, non-Godzilla kaiju movies out there that came out of Japan. There, it's a really good movie. And as far as a 10, I would give this one a 9.5 out of 10.
And with that, thank you so much for listening to our 65 Years of Rodan panel. We hope you have enjoyed Daikaiju Fest up to this point and will continue to enjoy the rest of Daikaiju Fest. Thank you so much for watching.
And we will see you in the next panel. Take care.